The night in Las Vegas still echoes in the hearts of all who witnessed it. The moment Khabib Nurmagomedov flew over the cage was more than just an outburst. It was a release of years' worth of anger, insults, and deep personal grudges. The fight between Khabib and Conor wasn't just a battle between two top-tier athletes. It was the collision of two completely different worlds. One calm and disciplined, shaped by the rugged mountains of Dagestan, and the other loud, brash, and rebellious, born under the chaotic lights of Dublin. That night wasn't just about a championship, it was war. And it didn't end when the bell rang. No, that's where it all truly began. Before the first punch was thrown, before the chokehold was locked in, the conflict had already escalated. Conor McGregor, a master of mind games, didn't stop at Khabib's fighting style. He went straight for the heart. He insulted his religion, mocked his family, and targeted his homeland. Calling Khabib a terrorist and hurling a dolly through a bus window full of his team, Conor crossed a line that would change everything. For Khabib, this fight wasn't about a title anymore. It was about something far more sacred, his honor. In his culture, words like that are never left unchecked. And when the cage door closed, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for something much bigger than that. The fight itself was a display of dominance. For 4 rounds, Khabib showed his complete control. He took Conor down, crushed his every move, and drained his will like a relentless predator stalking its prey. Between strikes, Khabib whispered to Conor, taunting him, punishing him, reminding him that actions have consequences. For the first time, Conor wasn't the hunter. He was the hunted. And when Khabib finally locked in the neck crank, it wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration. A declaration from a man who had been mocked, underestimated, and disrespected. A statement that stunned the world and silenced an arena. What followed, however, was a spectacle that would redefine the sport. Khabib, eyes ablaze with fury, threw himself over the cage and charged towards Dillon Danis, McGregor's teammate, the mouth behind the insults. Chaos erupted, security flooded in, fists were thrown, and fans screamed in disbelief. The largest pay-per-view in UFC history became an uncontrollable riot. It was more than just a fight, it was a scandal. And suddenly, the UFC had more than just a championship bout on its hands. It had a full-blown crisis. This wasn't about a belt anymore. It was personal, raw, and primal. The Nevada State Athletic Commission had no choice but to step in. Both fighters were suspended. Fines were levied. Khabib was fined $500,000 and given a 9-month suspension, which was later reduced after a public service message. Conor received a 6-month suspension as well. But these were just numbers. The real price was the damage to their reputations. Khabib, the quiet, disciplined warrior, had exploded. Conor, the brash former champion, had been dismantled. The world was watching, and the fallout had only just begun. Back in Dagestan, Khabib was celebrated as a hero. To them, he wasn't just a fighter, he was a defender of a sacred code. In a land where loyalty, faith, and respect run deeper than anything, his actions were not reckless, they were righteous. He had been pushed beyond his limits, humiliated, and provoked. Yet, in the end, he triumphed. His father, Abdulmanap, though critical of the post-fight chaos, reminded the world that discipline was the highest virtue. But in Dagestan, there was no question. Khabib had brought honor to his homeland in a way that went far beyond the confines of the cage. Meanwhile, Conor faded into the shadows. The man who once dominated the microphone now barely made a sound. A tweet here, an apology there, but it was too little, too late. The mystique had cracked. For years, Conor had pushed the limits, promoting himself through controversy and shock. But this time, he had crossed a line he couldn't return from. He had awakened a storm in Khabib, a storm that was unstoppable. Dana White, the UFC president, found himself at the eye of the storm. He had promoted this fight with the fervor of a general preparing for battle. But the aftermath? It was more than he had ever imagined. Questions began to arise. Had the UFC gone too far in building the animosity? Had their thirst for profits blinded them to the risks? Dana defended the promotion, but deep down, he knew the lines had been blurred. The UFC had gained attention, money, and headlines, but they had also been left with a stain. The aftermath of that fight wasn't just a story, It was a lesson. The media frenzy exploded. Sponsors took notice. MMA, once a niche sport, had now become a global phenomenon. Every sports network scrutinized the fight, every fan took sides. Was Khabib a hero defending his values, or had he lost control? Was Conor a genius provocateur, or had he crossed a line from which there was no return? These weren't mere discussions, they were deep divides. And for the UFC, those divides were both a blessing and a curse. Controversy sells, but at what cost? While the world dissected the fallout, Khabib remained silent. There was no press tour, no victory lap. Just a quiet resolve. No trash talk, no bravado. Just training, prayer, and time with family. The UFC had never seen a champion like this. A man who could walk away from the spotlight as easily as he walked through the fire. But that silence was deafening. It wasn't weakness. It was strength and restraint. The more Khabib stayed quiet, the louder the world spoke his name. His legend wasn't built through words, it was forged in action. As Khabib stayed silent, Conor plotted his return. But something had shifted. The air around him was no longer charged with the same electric energy. The loss to Khabib had taken its toll. It wasn't just physical, it was mental. The invincible man who once thrived in the spotlight had been broken in front of millions. Now, as he spoke of redemption, the doubt lingered. Could he reclaim his place atop the sport, or had Khabib's victory stripped him of the edge that once made him great? The talks of a rematch began almost immediately, not because it made sense from a competitive standpoint, but because it was a goldmine for the UFC. Dana White, ever the shrewd businessman, saw an opportunity to capitalize on the drama. This wasn't about whether Conor and Khabib should fight again. It was about the spectacle it would create. The UFC pushed, teased, and dangled the idea in front of the media, but Khabib? He wasn't interested. He made it clear Conor had to earn it. Beat someone, anyone, and then maybe the door would open. But for Khabib, it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the hype. His legacy had already been sealed in stone, and he wasn't going to tarnish it for another round of theatrics. Still, Conor returned. First, he faced Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone, a fight many believed had been set up to make Conor look good, to restore his confidence. And look good he did. In just 40 seconds, he took Cerrone down with a flawless combination of shoulders, knees, and his trademark left hand. The crowd erupted. The media buzzed. For a brief moment, it seemed like the old Conor was back. But beneath the surface, questions started to rise. Was this a real challenge, or had Cerrone's prime passed him by? Was this a legitimate test of Conor's skills, or was it a carefully scripted comeback? Conor celebrated, but Khabib wasn't fooled. He saw it for what it was, a show, not a war. And Khabib, a man who respected only real challenges, wasn't interested in the smoke and mirrors of Conor's grand return. Dana White, sensing the buzz around Conor's win, began to ramp up the push for a rematch. He called it the biggest fight in MMA history. He teased the storylines, fanned the flames of the rivalry. But Khabib resisted. To him, this wasn't about spectacle. It was about the pursuit of greatness. He wasn't looking for another payday or another blockbuster fight. He wanted to challenge himself, to leave behind a legacy that spoke of skill, discipline, and merit. Conor, in Khabib's eyes, wasn't chasing greatness. He was chasing relevance. And so the standoff continued. The UFC pushing for profit, Khabib standing guard over his principles. The quiet war unfolded not in the cage, but in interviews and headlines. Outside the octagon, Khabib became a symbol. He wasn't just a figure for Muslims or Dagestanis. He had become a hero for anyone who believed in discipline over drama, faith over fame. He turned down lucrative endorsement deals that didn't align with his values, refused to touch alcohol sponsors, and walked a path of integrity in a world increasingly driven by chaos. While other fighters clamored for attention, Khabib remained silent, letting his actions speak for him. His following grew not just in numbers but in depth. Fans didn't just watch him, they respected him. They emulated him. And through his silence, Khabib's influence reached far beyond the sport. It reached into boardrooms, mosques, and even the halls of government. Then tragedy struck. Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, Khabib's father, mentor, and guiding light passed away due to complications from COVID-19. It was a devastating loss that shook Khabib to his core. The man who had shaped his fighting style, his character, and his unwavering discipline was gone. For Khabib, it wasn't just the loss of a father, it was the loss of his foundation. Many questioned whether he would continue fighting, whether this would be the end of his career. But those who truly knew Khabib knew that he would honor his father's memory. He wouldn't crumble under the weight of loss. Instead, he would finish what his father had started. Then came the moment that shook the MMA world to its core. After months of uncertainty, Khabib stood in the center of the octagon, laid down his gloves, and announced his retirement. Undefeated, untouched. 29 fights, 29 wins. No controversies, no scandals. Just a flawless career. He told the world that without his father, he couldn't continue. He had made a promise to his mother that he would walk away from the sport when the time was right. And with that, he walked off. Quietly, without a grand farewell tour or victory parade. It was the final, silent exit of a man who had conquered everything, leaving behind a legacy that would be etched in the annals of combat sports history. The world was stunned. Fighters retire all the time, but never like this. Not at the peak of their career, not undefeated. Khabib's retirement didn't just mark the end of an era, it elevated the entire sport. He showed that it was possible to fight with purpose, to live with discipline, and to leave the sport with dignity. Khabib had redefined what it meant to be a champion. In a sport that thrives on chaos, he had found peace. And somehow that peace became the most powerful thing of all. Meanwhile, Conor McGregor's star continued to fade. As Khabib ascended to legend, Conor spiraled downward. Losses piled up. Dustin Poirier knocked him out, then broke his leg. The brash confidence returned, but it felt hollow, forced. The insults, the chaos, the swagger, they all felt like echoes of a past that no longer fit. The once mighty king now appeared like a ghost, wearing a crown that no longer fit his head. The fire was still there, but the flames had dimmed. And as Khabib watched from his mountain village in Dagestan, a quiet truth lingered. The fight had ended long ago. Only one man had truly won. The magnitude of the rivalry between Khabib and Conor could never be captured in numbers alone, but the numbers told their own story. Over 2.4 million official pay-per-view buys, tens of millions more watched through pirated streams. The UFC's value surged by hundreds of millions in a single day. Bars were packed, streets flooded with fans waving Irish and Russian flags, chanting the names of their respective heroes like soldiers going to war. Reporters from every corner of the world swarmed the scene. Even those who weren't fans of MMA tuned in not for the sport, but for the story. The clash of vengeance, ego, faith, and pride. This wasn't just a fight. It was a moment in history.